My name is Samantha Blake, and today I stood outside a grand hall at San Diego Naval Base, staring through the glass doors, watching my little brother pin on the silver eagle of a Marine Corps colonel. At a ceremony I wasn't allowed to attend. It still feels unreal saying those words out loud. The salty breeze from the bay stung my eyes as I tried to steady my breath. The glint of dress whites all around me, officers bustling to get inside, the low hum of a military band drifting out every time the doors swung open. And I'm a Vice Admiral in the United States Navy, the youngest woman to ever hold that rank. I've commanded carrier strike groups, run cyber defense operations that stopped entire fleets from going dark, and I've faced enemies on foreign seas who would kill me without blinking. Yet somehow, the hardest battlefield I've ever stepped onto is the one inside my own family. I guess I always knew there were cracks. Growing up in Annapolis, Maryland, every day felt like a naval drill. Dad was a decorated Navy captain who ran our home with the same discipline he brought to his command. Shoes shining on the porch steps. Breakfast on the table at Luro 600 sharp. Conversations peppered with Navy jargon like on deck and all hands. Mom was a high school English teacher, softer, but just as precise. And then there was Mike, 3 years younger than me, born with the same stubborn streak as every Blake who ever wore the uniform. We were inseparable kids. We'd build secret forts in the woods behind our house, whispering about imaginary enemies and daring rescue missions. I'd scribble tactical plans on scraps of paper, and Mike would follow me through the trees like a second-in-command, his freckled face fierce with loyalty. But somewhere along the way, the lines blurred. The medals I earned, the promotions I chased, each one seemed to widen the space between us. And standing outside those glass doors today, looking in on the man who used to chase me through mud puddles, I felt a chill deeper than any wind off the bay. Because it wasn't just an oversight that my name was missing from the guest list. I know that. I've seen too many covert operations, read too many intelligence briefings, to mistake a deliberate act for a clerical error. The truth is, my brother, my own flesh and blood, made a choice. And this time, the uniform I wear, the stars on my shoulders, the decades of loyalty I've given my country, none of it could open that door. But I wasn't going to walk away quietly. Not today. When I close my eyes, I'm 8 years old again, standing barefoot in the woods behind our house in Annapolis, Maryland, pine needles poking the soles of my feet, the scent of damp earth sharp and alive. Mike's voice floats through the branches. Admiral Sam, enemy spotted at 3 o'clock. I remember turning toward him, a plastic toy binoculars pressed to my face, whispering orders like they were classified secrets. Hold your position. We'll flank from the ridge. Even then, I wanted to be in charge. And even then, Mike was ready to follow me into any battle, real or imagined. We spent entire afternoons building forts from fallen branches, crawling through mud, pretending we were rescuing hostages or intercepting enemy transmissions. Our backyard was our battlefield. Our code words were sacred. The world inside those trees was ours alone, safe, invincible, and bursting with possibilities. But under all that adventure, there was something else too, a quiet tension that neither of us could name. Dad, Captain Richard Blake, carried the Navy in his bones. He'd come home in his khaki uniform, ribbons neat on his chest, eyes scanning us like we were junior sailors waiting for inspection. His voice could fill a parade ground, or fall to a single measured word that made you stand straighter. Discipline, Samantha. Attention to detail. That's what makes a leader. I craved his approval like oxygen. Every compliment from him felt like a medal pinned on my soul. But for Mike, it was different. He idolized Dad too. But he also wanted to breathe, to laugh a little louder, to leave his bed messy sometimes without feeling like he'd failed some invisible standard. Mom tried to balance it all. She'd slide a plate of warm cookies in front of us and murmur, "There's more to life than medals and ranks. She'd read us stories at night, poetry and novels about people who dared to follow their own paths. But even she couldn't shield us entirely from the magnetic pull of the Navy's orbit. By the time I hit 13, I was already obsessed with naval history, reading about battles in the Pacific, memorizing fleet formations, sketching ship schematics in the margins of my school notebooks. Mike, he was different. He loved the Marines, said he wanted to be the boots on the ground. He wanted action, the dirt under his fingernails, medals earned face to face with danger. Still, we were tight. I can still see the summer afternoon when he slipped off the narrow footbridge behind our neighborhood, hit the cold creek below with a splash so loud it scattered birds from the trees. I dove in without a thought, dragging him out as he coughed and sputtered. His eyes were huge, terrified. And then he started laughing, water streaming down his face. "You're crazy, Sam," he shouted. "Next time, you're going in first." We trudged home soaked to the bone, shivering and giggling, until Dad saw us and went silent, eyes dark with worry. But that was us, Mike and me, risking trouble together, always covering each other's six. And somewhere deep down, I think Mike always knew I'd jump in that water for him again, no matter how cold, no matter how many years passed. But life has a way of rewriting childhood promises, replacing forts and water rescues with medals, promotions, and doors slammed shut in your face. And as I stood outside that hall today, the girl who once charged into the creek felt 1,000,000 miles away, replaced by a woman in dress whites, clutching a reality I never wanted to face. By the time I turned 18, my path felt inevitable, like a compass needle pulled north. I traded prom dresses for Navy-issued fatigues, left behind the soft hush of Annapolis mornings, and stepped onto the steel decks of ships that smelled of salt and jet fuel. Boot camp nearly broke me. The screaming chiefs, the endless drills, the blistering heat rolling off the asphalt in Great Lakes, Illinois. But every time I thought I couldn't push another inch, I remembered Dad's voice echoing in my head. "Attention to detail, Samantha, even when no one's watching." So I gritted my teeth and kept going. After graduation, they shipped me out on the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, a behemoth of steel carving through the Atlantic. The first time I stood on the bridge, eyes scanning an endless horizon, I felt 10 feet tall. Those were years of saltwater and sacrifice, deployments that blurred together, weeks without sleep, days spent troubleshooting radar systems in storms that could swallow a ship whole. But I was good at it. Damn good. I had a knack for strategy, for seeing patterns other people missed. By 23, I was running operational planning drills for the entire strike group. By 27, I was a lieutenant commander, fielding encrypted comms in the middle of the Arabian Gulf, coordinating anti-piracy missions off the coast of Somalia. I earned my first Navy Commendation Medal after orchestrating an evacuation during a fire in the lower decks. 20 sailors trapped. Smoke so thick you could barely breathe. I remember kicking in that bulkhead door, dragging 2 guys out, half conscious, feeling the searing heat through my uniform. Later, a surgeon stitched up the burns on my left forearm, left me with a pale scar I still see every morning when I'm brushing my teeth. And the promotions kept coming. Each new stripe brought more weight on my shoulders and more distance between me and Mike. He'd joined the Marines when he turned 21, wanted to carve his own path, away from the Navy's shadow. He was good at what he did, a sharp officer. Brave as hell, but his climb was steady, not meteoric. Meanwhile, my name started landing in military journals, feature articles about the Navy's cyber genius, photos of me in conference rooms with Joint Chiefs, arguing for integrated cyber defense strategies. I led a task force that cracked an encrypted network used by a foreign adversary to track our fleet movements. I'll never forget the moment we intercepted a signal that could have cost lives and shut it down cold. They gave me the Legion of Merit for that one, and each medal felt like a piece of armor. But sometimes I wondered if it was also a wall. Because for every newspaper headline, there was a phone call with Mike that seemed shorter than the last. Fewer laughs, longer silences. Colonel Blake's sister. People would whisper when he walked by, no matter how many commendations he earned. No matter how many miles he ran in combat boots under the blistering sun. And the part that stung most was that he never said it outright. Never told me to my face that my success made his feel smaller. But I could feel it. Like a storm building just beyond the horizon. And I kept telling myself it would pass. That the bond we forged in the woods behind our house could survive anything. Even the weight of stars on my shoulders. It started out small, little cracks in the concrete that nobody noticed until they threatened to split the whole foundation. Mike and I were still talking then, but the calls were less frequent. When we did talk, it felt like a minefield, like I had to tiptoe around my own victories so I wouldn't make him feel like he was trailing behind. I remember one Christmas, sitting around the old oak dining table in our parents' house, the fireplace crackling, the scent of pine needles and cinnamon floating through the air. Dad lifted his glass and said, "To Admiral Blake, youngest flag officer in the fleet." Everyone cheered, except Mike. He forced a smile, but his eyes shifted toward his plate. A few minutes later, he excused himself to take a phone call that I'm pretty sure never happened. I found him out on the porch, breath steaming in the cold. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mike, talk to me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is this about Dad's toast?" He let out a harsh laugh. "It's always about Dad's toast, Sam. Or your next article in Military Times. Or that damn photo of you with the Secretary of Defense. You don't even have to try. Everything you touch turns into a headline." My stomach dropped. "I worked my ass off for those headlines. I know," he shot back. "But it doesn't change the fact that people look at me and see your shadow." For a second, I wanted to yell, to remind him how many times I'd stood up for him behind closed doors, but the words caught in my throat. Because deep down, I understood exactly what he meant. We stood there in silence, the only sound the distant hum of cars on the road. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "I just want one day, Sam, one day where it's not all about you." And that was the first time I realized that our bond wasn't unbreakable after all. When Mike went back to his base at Camp Pendleton, things were tense. He stopped telling me about his missions, stopped sending photos from deployments. I'd hear about his promotions through Dad, or worse, through official military memos. Around the same time, a new name started popping up in conversations: General Edward Grant. He was an old-school Marine Corps legend, chest full of ribbons, sharp jaw, sharper opinions. He believed the military was losing its warrior spirit under all the modern reforms. And he'd made it crystal clear he thought my cyber initiatives were soft, political, unnecessary. I never paid him much mind. I had bigger enemies to fight overseas. But as weeks turned into months, I started hearing that Mike was spending more time with Grant. Getting invited to private briefings, social events, strategy sessions. A mutual friend once told me, "Grant's taken a liking to your brother. Says he's a real Marine. Not caught up in the politics." I tried to brush it off. Mike was his own man. He could choose who he wanted to follow. But a little voice inside me whispered that something was shifting, and that maybe the greatest threat to my career and my family wasn't halfway across the world, but standing right next to my own brother. And as much as I wanted to believe we'd find our way back to each other, a part of me felt like I was watching our childhood fort collapsing one plank at a time, while I was powerless to stop it. The sun rose over San Diego that morning, streaking the sky with fiery pink and gold. So brilliant it almost felt like an omen. I pulled into the base, tires crunching on gravel, the gates opening automatically as the guards recognized my car. My uniform was perfect navy whites, every ribbon gleaming, the 4 silver stars on my shoulder boards catching the sunlight like polished steel. Inside, the air buzzed with ceremony. Flags lined the corridors. A brass band rehearsed the Marines' hymn in a distant room. horns sharp and proud. Family members in dresses and suits clustered near the entrance to the hall, chattering about promotions and deployments. I clutched the velvet box I'd brought for Mike, a custom Marine Corps dagger with his initials engraved on the blade. A tradition in our family, a symbol that you'd earned your place among warriors. But as I stepped toward the registration table, a young Marine in dress blues blocked my path. "Ma'am, may I see your name, please?" I smiled. "Vice Admiral Samantha Blake. I'm here for Colonel Michael Blake's promotion ceremony." He blinked twice. Admiral Blake, just a moment, ma'am." He typed rapidly into his tablet, brows pulling tighter with every second. I shifted the dagger box in my hands, feeling an unease unfurl in my chest. Finally, he looked up, voice low. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not listed on the guest roster." I stared at him, sure I'd misheard. "That's not possible. I'm his sister. Check the family section." "I did, ma'am." He swallowed hard. "You're not there." A current of cold swept through me. Even though the hallway was stifling with heat and cologne, I leaned closer. "Then check VIP military guests." "I've checked every section, ma'am. Your name's not there." Behind me, a couple of senior officers passed by, giving me polite nods, eyes flicking curiously between me and the flustered Marine. I caught a glimpse of Mike through the glass doors of the hall. He was laughing with a group of officers, General Grant, standing right beside him, and when Mike's eyes met mine, he went utterly still, just for a split second. Then he turned his head away, like he hadn't seen me at all. That hit harder than any enemy fire I'd ever faced. My voice felt far away in my own ears. "Is Colonel Blake aware I'm not on the list?" The Marine hesitated. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm authorized to ask him directly." General Grant's staff provided the final guest roster. The name felt like poison in my mouth. "General Grant." "Yes, ma'am." And just like that, the truth snapped into focus. This wasn't a clerical error. It was a choice, a deliberate move to keep me out, keep me from overshadowing Mike, keep the ceremony purely traditional, as Grant would put it. My blood pounded so hard I felt dizzy. Memories crashed over me the creek behind our childhood home. The time I'd pulled Mike out of freezing water. The countless times I'd protected his reputation with senior brass. All of it, flickering through my mind like scenes from a movie I could barely watch. I squared my shoulders. "Thank you, Corporal. Carry on." "Ma'am, are you sure we can try?" "That's an order." I turned away, boots clicking on the polished floor, the weight of the dagger box suddenly impossible in my hand. Outside, the California sun felt cruelly bright. I found a spot near the fountain and sat down, the sound of water splashing over marble masking the hammer of my pulse. The band struck up inside, drums rolling. Applause thundered as someone announced Mike's name over the PA system. I thought about storming in there anyway, about making them look me in the eye as they tried to pretend I didn't exist. But a voice inside me, honed by years of command and protocol, whispered that this wasn't the time for fireworks. Not yet. So I sat there, still as stone, as the ceremony for my own brother unfolded on the other side of a wall of glass. And every second I stayed outside felt like another piece of our childhood, shattering beyond repair. I stayed on that stone bench for what felt like hours, the roar of the crowd drifting through the courtyard every time the hall doors cracked open. Seagulls wheeled overhead, crying into the sharp, salty wind off San Diego Bay. The velvet dagger box sat heavy in my lap, like a weight chained to my chest. For years, I'd led carrier groups through combat zones. I'd stared down foreign commanders across mahogany conference tables, traded threats in clipped sentences, played high-stakes chess with national security. But nothing, not a single classified briefing or combat op, had ever hollowed me out the way that moment did. Because the enemy wasn't some faceless adversary on the other side of the ocean. It was my own brother, standing behind a closed door, pretending I wasn't there. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Laura Chen, my oldest friend from the academy. I swiped to answer, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, Sam, are you there? You were supposed to text me when you got inside." I never got inside. A pause stretched between us, crackling with disbelief. What do you mean you never got inside? My name wasn't on the list. Grant's fingerprints are all over this. Oh, Sam. I could almost see Laura pressing her fingers to her temples, eyes squeezed shut in frustration. I'm coming down there right now. Nah, don't. It'll just make it worse. Another silence. Then Laura spoke, her voice low. I know you. Sam, you're sitting out there, telling yourself it's better to stay quiet, to keep the peace, but you don't owe them your silence. I'm not trying to make a spectacle. Since when is showing up for your brother a spectacle? I stared at the dagger box, running my thumb over the silver engraving. Michael J. Blake, Semper Fidelis. It's not just about Mike. I whispered. It's about the whole room in there. Grant wants to prove a point, that the old ways still decide who belongs, that people like me, women like me, are just political distractions. Laura's voice hardened, and if you let them keep you out, that's the point he'll prove. The breeze picked up, whipping my hair across my face. Inside, the band launched into the national anthem, the notes slicing through me like glass. I swallowed, my throat tight. I don't want to embarrass Mike. Sam, your brother excluded the Vice Admiral of the United States Navy from his promotion. That's not on you. A wave of exhaustion rolled over me. It felt like my bones were made of lead, but underneath it all, a spark flared. A flicker of something I'd nearly forgotten. Rage, not the wild, reckless fury of youth, but a cold, controlled anger that had carried me through storms and cyber attacks and long nights in war rooms. I stood up, squaring my shoulders, feeling the weight of my stars settle into place. I'm not walking away. Laura, damn right you're not. Call you back. I hung up and looked out across the bay, the sun glinting off the surface like shattered glass. I remembered the little boy in muddy fatigues, following me through the trees, trusting me to lead the way. And I thought, maybe it was time to remind him who I was. Not just his sister. Not just the woman in dress whites, but the officer who'd spent her entire career fighting battles both seen and unseen. And I knew, as sure as the ocean crashing against the piers, that this fight wasn't over. I left the fountain behind me, the dagger box tucked under my arm like a secret weapon. My shoes struck the pavement in sharp, decisive beats, echoes chasing me down the breezeway between the chapel and the officers' club. My mind felt like a targeting system, each thought locking onto the next step I had to take. I dialed Captain David Summers, the base commander. His number burned into my memory after years of coordinating joint exercises. He picked up on the second ring. Vice Admiral Blake. Captain, I need access to the west entrance of the promotion hall. Discreetly, there was a pause. Then the weight of authority shifted in his voice. Yes, ma'am, I'll handle it. I ended the call, inhaling deep lungfuls of briny air, feeling the adrenaline flush warmth back into my limbs. A seagull screamed overhead, banking sharply before disappearing beyond the corner of a hangar. I popped the latch on my car and pulled out my ceremonial dress blue uniform, the one reserved for official portraits, congressional hearings, and moments when you needed every single ribbon, every piece of brass, to remind people who the hell you were. In the ladies' room near the officers' club, I changed with practiced precision. I could still hear the muffled strains of the Marine Corps hymn floating across the courtyard. Button by button, I transformed from the woman sitting alone by a fountain back into Admiral Blake. I pinned my medals onto the dark blue fabric, each one a chapter written in salt, sweat, and blood. The Silver Star from the Gulf of Aden rescue mission, the Legion of Merit for dismantling that enemy cyber network before it could sink our Pacific fleet, the Purple Heart, earned on a night in the North Arabian Sea when I dragged 2 sailors out of a burning compartment and woke up 2 days later with stitches running down my leg. Each piece of colored ribbon and polished metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, singing a silent, unignorable truth. I was here because I'd earned it. Every stripe, Every star. When I emerged, Captain Summers was waiting at the west entrance. He saluted sharply, eyes darting over my uniform, a flicker of something like relief crossing his face. "Admiral, your presence is noted and welcomed." "Thank you. Captain, I want no disruption. I'll enter quietly and wait for the right moment." He nodded. "Understood." I slipped into the cool darkness of the hall, moving like a ghost through narrow corridors lined with framed portraits of naval heroes. At a junction near the rear entrance, I paused, adjusting my cover, checking my medals one last time. My heart was a steady drumbeat. I wasn't going in there to cause chaos, but I wasn't going to let General Grant or anyone else rewrite the rules of who belonged. I'd learned long ago that silence can be a weapon used against you. I would speak not just as Samantha Blake, the sister who once pulled her little brother from a freezing creek, but as Vice Admiral Blake, sworn to protect the integrity of the uniform I wore. I tucked the dagger box under my arm, felt the cool metal through the velvet, and whispered to myself, this isn't just about family anymore. Then I turned toward the glowing doorway that led to the main floor and stepped forward into the light. The hall was packed to the rafters. Rows of officers in dress uniforms filled every pew-like seat, brass gleaming under the high lights, the air thick with the smell of starched fabric and polished leather. A ripple of whispers swept through the room as I emerged from the side aisle, my heels striking the polished floor like a drum roll. Heads turned, some jaws dropped. The young Marine at the back who'd tried to stop me earlier stood so stiff he looked ready to pass out. I saw Mike at the podium, a single spotlight catching the fresh silver eagles on his shoulders. His hand gripped the wooden edges so hard his knuckles went pale. He faltered mid-sentence, eyes locking on me across the cavernous space. For a heartbeat, the whole room felt like it inhaled as one. I kept moving forward, each step slow, deliberate, the ribbons on my chest catching the light like stained glass. General Edward Grant, seated in the front row, leaned back in his chair, arms folded tight across his chest, jaw clenched. I stopped at the edge of the stage, the dagger box tucked neatly under my arm. Mike cleared his throat, voice brittle. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. It's been a journey." Silence stretched like wire. General Grant shot him a look, sharp as a blade. Mike tried again. "Serving in the Marine Corps has been the honor of my life. And his voice trailed off as I stepped up onto the stage beside him. I turned to the crowd, scanning familiar faces, admirals, generals, junior officers who'd watched me blaze through ranks most women were never allowed to dream of. My voice came out clear, steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Vice Admiral Samantha Blake, and I stand here today, not just as an officer of the United States Navy, but as the sister of Colonel Michael Blake." The crowd shifted, murmuring softly. I felt Mike stiffen beside me. "I wasn't on the guest list this morning." I continued, my gaze drifting pointedly to General Grant. "But some doors. You don't wait for an invitation to walk through." A faint gasp rippled through the audience. Mike finally spoke, his voice low. "Sam, don't do this here." I turned to face him fully. "Don't do what?" "Mike, tell the truth that your own sister, who's stood watch in war zones, who's bled for this country, was shut out of her brother's promotion ceremony." He swallowed, eyes glimmering under the lights. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Then how was it supposed to be?" I shot back. "A perfect photo op for you and Grant. A day where the traditional values crowd gets to pretend I don't exist." Grant rose abruptly, voice slicing through the tension. "This is not the time or place, Admiral." I met his stare head on. "With respect. General, if not here, then where? Where do we talk about respect, about the cost of loyalty, about family?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I turned back to Mike, softer now. Do you remember the creek behind our house? Mike. The day you fell in and I dragged you out, coughing and freezing. He blinked, the memory clearly hitting him like a physical blow. I'd do it again. I said, even today. Even after this. He dropped his eyes. I know, but understand this. I continued, my voice regaining steel. Being a leader isn't about hiding from hard truths. It's not about shrinking other people so you can stand taller. Mike shook his head, voice cracking. I was tired of hearing people say I only got where I am because of you. I felt my chest tighten. And I was tired of hearing people say I didn't belong because I was a woman. He looked up, eyes shining. I didn't want you to steal my moment. And I never wanted to. I said, but you let them weaponize your insecurities. You let Grant and his people make this about politics instead of family. He swallowed, voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry. A hush fell over the crowd as those two words hung in the air. I reached into the velvet box and pulled out the Marine Corps dagger. The blade, catching the stage lights in a deadly gleam. I held it out to him. Congratulations, Colonel Blake. You've earned this. Not because of me. Not because of them. Because you're a damn good Marine. He stared at the dagger, then took it carefully, his hands trembling. Applause erupted, tentative at first, then building into a steady wave. I turned to the crowd, speaking over the clapping. Family doesn't mean silence. It means speaking up, even when it hurts. Especially then. Grant stood motionless, watching me with unreadable eyes. Mike glanced my way, then nodded once, tight, but genuine. And for the first time that day, I saw my little brother again. Not the Marine, not the rival, but the kid who once followed me into every battle, certain I'd never let him drown. After the ceremony, the reception hall was a swirl of white gloves, crisp uniforms, and crystal glasses clinking softly over polite conversation. A string quartet played near the far windows, sunlight spilling in to gild the polished floor. I stood near a table of hors d'oeuvres, the dagger box finally empty in my hand, feeling the weight of eyes on me from every corner of the room. Officers approached in quiet waves. Some offered measured nods. Others clasped my hand firmly, murmuring words like, hell of a speech, Admiral, or glad you said what needed saying. I could see the calculations flickering behind their eyes, reassessing alliances, recalibrating where they stood in the shifting sands between old traditions and new realities. Across the room, General Grant lingered near the bar, surrounded by a few officers who looked far less certain of him than they had an hour earlier. He glanced my way once, eyes narrow, then turned away without a word. Mike moved through the crowd with a tentative calm. People slapped him on the back, congratulating him. But the conversations seemed shorter, more cautious, as though everyone was waiting to see what came next. At one point, our father, Captain Richard Blake, approached us both, his chest rising and falling like he'd run a marathon. That was quite an entrance. Samantha, I gave him a wry smile. Not exactly how I pictured the day going. Dad, he looked from me to Mike, his eyes glinting. But sometimes the Navy's about weathering storms, even the ones in your own family. Mike managed a tired grin. You always said the hardest battles are the ones you fight with the people you love. Dad clapped a hand on his son's shoulder. And the ones worth fighting most. I watched Mike's shoulders relax, just a fraction, for the first time all day. He seemed a little less like a man drowning in expectations, and a little more like my brother again. Toward the end of the reception, Mike stepped closer, voice low. I'm thinking of putting in for a transfer to Quantico. I blinked, caught off guard. Quantico, that's a big change. Yeah, he said, rubbing a thumb along the edge of the dagger's hilt. I think I need to build something for myself, away from all this noise. My chest ached at the thought, but I forced a nod. That sounds like the right call. I'm proud of you, Mike. He held my gaze for a long moment. I know, I haven't always shown it, but I'm proud of you too. A hush fell between us. A silence dense with all the things we'd never said, and everything we finally understood. Then Mike cracked a grin. Next time, try not to crash my party quite so hard. I laughed, shaking my head. No promises, Marine. We both glanced around the room, where conversation flowed again, the tension ebbing like the tide going out. And I thought, maybe it wasn't perfect. Maybe we'd never get back to the days of secret forts and whispered missions in the woods. But maybe we'd found a new way forward, not as the Admiral and the Colonel, not as competitors, but as brother and sister, willing to fight for the space where both of us belonged. Later that night, I sat alone in my apartment overlooking the bay, city lights shimmering on the dark water like scattered stars. My dress blues hung over the back of a chair, ribbons catching glints of passing headlights, silent reminders of the roads I'd traveled to earn every single piece of colored cloth. I cradled a mug of coffee in my hands, steam rising into the quiet, and thought about how strange it is that sometimes the people you'd die for are the same ones who can wound you the deepest. I thought about Mike, about all the moments we'd shared, from muddy childhood rescues to standing side by side under those glaring stage lights. I thought about how loyalty isn't blind obedience. It's having the courage to speak the truth, even when your voice shakes. And I realized leadership doesn't always happen behind a podium or with medals shining on your chest. Sometimes, leadership is walking back into a room that tried to shut you out and refusing to let silence write your story. So here's what I've learned. For anyone listening tonight, respect is earned, not demanded. Family bonds are precious, but they're not an excuse to betray who you are. And the toughest battles aren't fought overseas, but inside the rooms where love and pride collide. So I ask you, when have you had to choose between staying silent and standing your ground? When have you risked peace for the sake of truth? Because I'll tell you this, your worth is never determined by who tries to keep you out. It's measured by how fiercely you hold the door open, for yourself and for the ones who come after you.